So our event tonight is titled Fire on the Mountain, Shining a Light onto the Culture of Charis and Andrew Wommack Ministries. In this presentation, we are featuring an interview with reporter and advocate Logan Davis, based on his in-depth 3-part investigation into Andrew Wommack and Charis Bible College. This event is sponsored by Tuff, Teller United for Facts and Freedom, a nonpartisan local organization devoted to educating Teller County about trends that affect their government, city, businesses, and schools. Now, for some housekeeping. We've got some rules tonight, and so for everyone's enjoyment and safety this evening, we please ask that you abide by them. During the interview portion, please do not make any comments or disrupt the interview in any manner, and remain in your seat until the break. At that time, you will be given an opportunity to write down questions you may have for the Q&A session at the end of the program. Questions will be selected by a random drawing, which I will be pulling out of a box. And those whose questions are chosen will be allowed to come up right down here. I will hold the microphone for you, and you can ask your question. And a couple more requests with that are that repeats of the same question will not be allowed, and only one question may be asked by each person. Throughout the evening, please be aware that we are recording this event on live stream, and there is another camera in the room as well. If anyone becomes disruptive, please know that we will be giving 2 warnings to take your seat, and please remain quiet. And if someone refuses to do so, that person will be requested to leave the building. If anyone refuses to leave the building, the police will have to be notified. Fortunately, Tuff has never had to go to those lengths, but we just had to say it. All right. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening. Logan M. Davis is our guest tonight. He's a, ooh, hello. We'll let that one slide. Okay, so Logan M. Davis is our guest tonight. He is a researcher, political consultant, and journalist based in Denver who specializes in the threat posed to democracy by extremism. Logan is a proud member of the Denver News Guild and co-founder of the nonpartisan Political Workers Guild of Colorado. Logan's writings regularly appear in the Colorado Times Recorder, including his 3-part series on Andrew Wommack and Charis Bible College, and his 7-part series on the current political landscape of Woodland Park. Logan has also written many articles on the effects of Christian nationalism on both local and national government. Also with us tonight is Jonathan Sawyer, who will be interviewing Logan regarding his series on Andrew Wommack and Charis. Jonathan is a PhD candidate at CU Boulder and works with the National Education Policy Center. His dissertation research examines the religion clauses of the First Amendment and the constitutional rights of students attending publicly funded religious schools. In addition, Jonathan has a wealth of knowledge about the religious movement known as the New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR, which influences Andrew Wommack and Charis. Jonathan studied in a school associated with the early NAR leadership networks and personally experienced emotional, spiritual, and physical abuse while as a student. For this reason, Jonathan is uniquely qualified to understand the kinds of trauma that Logan Davis uncovered during his investigation. So, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Logan Davis and Jonathan Sawyer.
Right. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to ask John to introduce himself, but also I would like to thank him so much for being here and for doing this. John and I have been Twitter friends over our shared areas of interest for quite some time, but had not had the opportunity to meet or do anything in person yet, and so this is a fun opportunity.
Thank you all. Really, really wonderful to be here. The topics that we'll be discussing tonight, as was alluded to earlier by Nicole, hit pretty close to home for me, and I've been quite inspired by Logan's work and very much look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, sir. Still muted, thank you, sir. I also want to thank Nicole again. Nicole McNulty has been a partner in this endeavor. Only my name was on that series, and there's a lot in there that I wouldn't have been able to produce without Nicole's help. And over the course of several months, we became sort of the only 2 people in the world who had sort of done this kind of deep dive into these organizations. And there's a lot that we could kind of only talk to each other about because nobody else really had the language or experience except for, of course, our sources who had lived it. And the other people I want to thank before we get started here are Tim and Karina McDermott, who are here in the front row. Anybody who read the series knows that Tim was a primary source for much of that as both a former Charis student and a former Charis employee. For many years, and having left, in fact, now Tim's entire family has left Charis, and they were hugely instrumental in reporting a lot of what I was able to report in this series. So really thrilled to have the McDermotts here as well. This was truly not possible without y'all.
Great. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Logan, you're particularly well acquainted with Woodland Park as a journalist. In fact, as Nicole McNulty mentioned, you've already written an in-depth 7-part series on Woodland Park last year with an entire section devoted to Andrew Wommack, political influence on this town and school board. So what first created your interest in the political landscape of Woodland Park?
That is a good question. I feel in a lot of ways like a lot of the circumstances of my life and career kind of conspired to make this very interesting to me and to provide me with some of the skills to explore it a little bit more. I was raised in a very conservative Christian community in Nashville, Tennessee, where I was a pastor's kid. And I was also raised in what we would now recognize as a Christian nationalist community, and a fairly severe kind. For those less familiar with the term, I tend to define Christian nationalism as a movement primarily amongst white evangelicals, but a movement which seeks to merge American identity with Christian identity and believes that the Bible should play a leading role in the making of laws. So that's a lot of what my background was, and that's something I struggled with but was very much raised in. And then, as is the cliche, I sort of liberalized a little bit in college. I started working in politics, I moved out here, and I ran campaigns for a number of years. And then things started changing. Around 2017, 2018, I struggled to maintain my interest in standard electoral politics versus what we were seeing as the rising trends of extremism and conspiracism, which were increasingly dominating the political landscape. And it feels crazy to look back on that being 6-7 years ago, because now those things are day-to-day realities of virtually all American politics. So I got sort of waylaid from my quest of running a bunch of campaigns by becoming fascinated by the rise of conspiracism and extremism, and also really wanting to understand those things. It's easy to sort of gawk at people who subscribe to QAnon or this or the other, but it gets a little harder when every time you log online, those people are the parents of friends you knew growing up, or the teachers who you trusted and looked up to. And that created in me a desire not just to sort of gawk at and combat these things, but to understand. There's nothing I find nearly as interesting as why people believe what they believe. So I started working more, less in campaign politics strictly and more in research and communications dedicated towards counter-extremism work, disinformation work, and things that dealt a little bit more with the very tumultuous but very important information space. And through doing that, I ended up having the great fortune of being given a weekly column with the Colorado Times-Recorder, which I have exploited to the best of my ability to investigate and cover things that I think are genuinely interesting. So this is a very long way of saying that my initial interest in Woodland Park was completely accidental. In 2022 or 2023, a friend of mine who at that time worked with teachers around the country or around the state reached out to me, and she said, "Have you seen any of this stuff happening in Woodland Park?" Referring to then the school board drama. And I hadn't. And trying to do a favor for a friend, I told her I would look into it and maybe write a piece if I found something. And then I found something, and I kept finding things. And I think, as a lot of you who are familiar with the last few years of turmoil up here know, this is a story that it's almost impossible to find the edges of. So I, in many ways, feel like I am still in the initial looking into it process that I told my friend Lauren 2 years ago that I would do. And I think any day now, we're gonna have some findings on what we've looked into here. So really what happened is I started looking into it, and the role that Charis and Andrew Wommack were playing in influencing the school board, I did write a little bit about that in the school board series, but I was not satisfied that I had gotten the answers I was really looking for. And so I continued pursuing those answers even after that series was written, and eventually that sort of started snowballing towards more of this. So that's a long way of saying that I was trying to do a very simple favor for a friend about 2 years ago, and I am still doing it.
Thank you. You know, I'm 44 and attended a school that was influenced by the Word of Faith movement, that was influenced by the early New Apostolic Reformation, which we'll talk about a bit later. But I wanted to emphasize that Logan's work has been so meaningful because for those of us who have survived contexts where there are authoritarian dynamics at play, where there is manipulations of minds and hearts, you can feel alone in this process. And so having people voice this is so critically important, and I express my gratitude to you for that. So in addition to writing your 7-part series on Woodland Park and its school board, in March of this year, you then proceeded to write the very first expose of the narrowgate cult led by Andrew Wirtz. And we don't use the term cult lightly, and I know Logan will be talking about that in a moment. But although the narrowgate existed in Pennsylvania in the 1990s, what many people don't know is that Andrew Wirtz is currently the senior vice president of Andrew Wommack Ministries International and Charis Bible College. So Logan, can you describe the connection between Andrew Wirtz and Andrew Wommack, as well as what made narrowgate qualify as a cult?
Absolutely. The narrowgate story really impacted me. Having survivors of a cult, and I'll give you the Cliff Notes version in a minute, really share their pain and their experiences with me and trust me to relay those things in a way that they felt was faithful to their experiences. That is something I took very seriously, and it was very daunting at the time, and in retrospect, I feel that it also really prepared me for what was necessary in the reporting of the Charis series, and I'm really grateful for that. The Cliff's Notes version of narrowgate is that it existed in the mid to late 90s, in and around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was started as a Bible study amongst a group of students at Messiah University. It was Messiah College then. It is now Messiah University, just outside of Harrisburg. And charismatic, soon-to-be graduating senior Andy Wirtz was one of the initial leaders of this group and slowly exerted more and more control over it, and over the course of several months got most members to move off of campus. Many of them dropped out of college. They ended up inhabiting a small handful of shared residences. They also ended up surrendering their credit cards, their valuables, their relationships with their families, and virtually everything else to Andy Wirtz, who had convinced them that he was receiving divine revelations from on high and that the best way to practice their faith was to do everything he said unhesitatingly. And that was very effective. For much of the time that Wirtz was doing that, every single narrowgate survivor I spoke to told me that he was basing his sermons on audio cassette tapes put out by a then radio evangelist located out west. And that they would go over those sermons and then he would kind of riff on those, and that was the basis of the theology for the group. That evangelist whose tapes he was using to build narrowgate was Andrew Wommack. So the theological basis for the narrowgate cult, which Andy Wirtz then applied with a very strict authoritarian hand, that theological basis was Andrew Wommack's cassette tapes. We will get into a little bit about how there are similarities and differences, and we do not want to hang all of narrowgate's sins on Charis or Andrew Wommack. It simply would not be fair or accurate. But his teachings were involved from the beginning. Over the course of a few years, narrowgate gets really bad. It gets really bad. Eventually, Andy Wirtz's then wife fled in the night with their recently newborn baby, afraid that he might kill them. He is currently the senior vice president at Andrew Wommack Ministries. Things eventually went completely off the rails for narrowgate, and what's honestly one of the things that makes it a good story, a good narrative, is that this cult, which lasted for 4 or 5 years, collapsed over the course of a long weekend. Wirtz attempted to branch out completely from anything that Wommack has ever taught, and he decided to attempt to introduce a teaching of essentially partner-swapping spiritual marriage, in which he would determine who pairs off with who else in the group. And this seems to have been a little bit of an ad hoc rationalization for the affair that he was already having with a group member. And as this got out of the group, it was almost like he squeezed too hard all at once on the control he had exerted over them, and it broke. And people kind of fractured. And eventually, Andy Wirtz and his now wife, who was the member he had been having an affair with at that time, they moved out here in about 2001 or 2002 and started working in the Andrew Wommack Ministries call center and have remained with the ministry ever since then. And Andrew Wirtz has risen to be the third most senior person in that entire organization. So the connection there is both that it was based theologically on some of Wommack's teachings initially, and that Wirtz then essentially fled from the wreckage of his cult to Wommack and has worked for him for a quarter century since then. I think zeroing in on a couple of those questions, it's fairly uncontroversial to call Narrowgate a cult. That's not the case with every group we'll talk about tonight, and we can get there, but it is fairly uncontroversial to call Narrowgate a cult. The model that I tend to use, although there are many wonderful models for diagnosing and identifying cults and high control groups, I tend to fall back on the BITE model by a guy named Dr. Stephen Hassan because it's very understandable. BITE is an acronym. It stands for Behavior, Information, Thought, and Emotion. A group that exerts tight control over all four of those. That's a high control group. That's a cult. The extent to which their finances were controlled as well, it very much met the definition. When you look at, for instance, Andy Wirtz controlling Narrowgate members' access to information by keeping them isolated, feeding a persecution narrative about the outside world being out to get them, those are powerful controllers over thoughts and emotion. And effectively, what ultimately made Narrowgate such an effective high control group is that Andy Wirtz was able to convince his followers that obedience to him was one and the same as obedience to God. And when these were young people who had gone to a Christian college, were earnest in pursuing their faith, you're being told something like that, and you want to be faithful. Sometimes you listen, and sometimes it leads you down a dangerous path. We do know, lastly on Narrowgate, we do know that Andrew Wommack is aware of the Narrowgate cult and what Andy Wirtz did back then. We know that not only because I interfaced extensively with the ministry in writing the Narrowgate story to get them to provide comment of any sort. We also know this because a group of Narrowgate survivors in 2021, upon finding out that Andy Wirtz was senior vice president at Wommack Ministries, they sent a very long, detailed letter to the ministry explaining that there had never been any repentance, explaining what had happened, there had never been any apology, anything like that. And what they received back was a 3 or 4 line letter on the letterhead that said, basically, we talked to him about it, he said he repented, it's all good. And nothing else has ever been done. So it is interesting, and I think that it is troubling that the senior staff at Charis and at Andrew Wommack Ministries are very aware of this man's past and have still left him in a very prominent leadership role.
You know, I can't help while I'm here recalling similar dynamics from the Bible college that I attended, which is now defunct. It was known as Spirit Life Bible College. It was a part of a ministry called Robert's Lairdon Ministries, and there was some quite harmful things that were happening within that ministry. And when a big scandal emerged in the organization and the church, which eventually led to the organization imploding, instead of there being real accountability, the faithful in that particular group came to the church. People who were perceived to be threats to the ministry were not let in, and everybody gave the individual a round of applause and praised this individual, while those who were hurt were left on the sidelines. And that memory came to me thinking about this concept of cult. What are the similarities or the differences that you see, Logan, between Wirtz's group and Andrew Wommack Ministries?
I think that's a very important question. We will not camp out on Narrowgate all night. I understand that this is a cult that existed in a different state in a different century. It plays in a little bit. I think this question of similarities and differences is key to it, though. There are important similarities, and there are also important differences. In terms of what they have in common, they really do share a great deal of theology. There's the charismatic Pentecostal strain of Christianity, very influenced by what we call the Word of Faith movement, although as John knows, the sort of fractious nature of the Pentecostal movement in the second half of the 20th century, they're not latter rain, right? But there are all of these movements that are, to you and I, would seem very, very similar, and to them, I think, would not. The language can be tricky here as well, because Mr. Wommack and his organizations very, very intently attempt to avoid definition and using adjectives for themselves. I think I actually quote Tim saying this in the story. But that being said, this charismatic Pentecostal strain of Christianity that both Narrowgate and Charis and Andrew Wommack Ministries inhabit is really animated in large part by some of these prosperity gospel teachings of health and wealth, but also by this idea that leaders can receive divine revelations from God, which of course gives them an enormous amount of authority in the lives of their followers. And that's not something that you find in every brand of Christianity. I would wager to say it's not something you find in most versions of Christianity. The differences, however, are much more important. We are talking about an absolute high control cult which ruined lives, stole tens of thousands of dollars from its adherents, separated them from their families. It would not be fair or accurate to say that that is the same thing that Charis and Wommack are doing. And I think that where we see a lot of the difference here is that Andy Wirtz, at the time that he started and ran Narrowgate, was a man in his early 20s, very sure of himself, and he really applied that authority that he usurped with his claims to divine revelation. He applied it like you would expect a man in his early to mid-20s with an authoritarian streak to apply it. And it worked for a while, and then it didn't. It was significantly less refined, and it was also significantly stricter and more authoritarian. The level of mistreatment in Narrowgate is not something that we are seeing replicated as such at Charis, but a lot of the beliefs, and especially that belief in leaders receiving divine revelation and that bestowing an enormous amount of authority on them, that is something these groups very much do have in common.
Thank you. These conversations are important not only for communities, for the health of communities, but also for the individuals who are involved in these groups. It can be extremely difficult because there's so much shame associated at times with involvement with certain religious organizations that have become abusive due to many factors. Yet you managed to find nearly 24 former followers and students of Andrew Wommack and Charis. And to those former students and followers, I applaud your bravery and your courage. Can you tell us about how you accomplished to do that and what special challenges the process entailed for you?
Absolutely. With any good story, the first source is the hardest. Stories where the sources are just kind of sitting out in the open, those have already been reported, as it turns out. I worked for months. Like I said earlier, I included a piece in the school board series last year touching on some of Wommack's more political beliefs and how they have played into happenings with the school board in recent years. But I came out of that unsatisfied that I had really gotten in there. And so as I worked on Narrowgate, as I worked all through last winter, I also sent some random messages to people who I had sort of put together on Facebook or this or that, had been members of Charis at one time or another, and I never got anything back. And then in January, late January, it was actually 2 days before I came down here in February and was pretty soundly protested. That was a very interesting night for me because 2 days earlier, I had received an email out of the blue from a former Charis student, a Charis graduate, saying basically, stumbled across some of your work. Would I be correct in assuming you don't have any inside sources yet? I said, yes. So we got on the phone for 4 hours. And then the next day we got on the phone for another 3 hours. And so by the time I came down that evening and then was sort of very protested by a group of Charis people, what they did not know was that I had just cracked the code right before that and had just spent the preceding 2 days talking for 7-8 hours with an insider about what that experience had been like. So it was as that was happening that my understanding of Charis was really blossoming. I had already gone through everything in the public record, the finances, all of that, and it was not telling me a human story. And suddenly I had a human source willing to tell me those stories. And eventually he was also able to point me in the direction of some other people who he thought might be willing to talk. Some of those really paid off, and it kind of spiraled like that. And ironically, that protest that evening of February 2nd, earlier this year, that also seems to have triggered some folks in the community to reach out to me as well. As best I can figure, it's because my name perhaps circulated in Charis circles in the recruiting for that protest. They had to get people signed up to come protest me, and I don't really know how all that worked, but I did end up getting some interesting outreach after that. So in that way, Charis was actually quite helpful in my sourcing for this. But getting sources to talk and really getting into that important material, those are very different tasks. And with a lot of these sources, there was some really important and really necessary trust building that had to go into that. There is a kind of journalist out there who's really good at kind of like building this fake connection with people and getting something out of them, and then it's kind of on to the next one. I'm sure that is easier. It is not an ability I feel that I really have, and I think that has worked really well because instead of just asking people to be vulnerable, I have shared vulnerability in return in a lot of cases, and it is not some random act that made me very interested in ideas like Christian nationalism and spiritual abuse. It is my own experience with those things. And so it was really important for me to communicate to these sources that I wasn't there to be a tourist for their trauma. I was, if anything, a fellow traveler in it, and it was something that I wanted to be able to understand in a way that I could tell it and help other people understand as well. And so there was real relationship building. There are sources who I am very fortunate to consider my friends now, and that is not always the case, but this was such a long, intimate process of sharing some very, very difficult experiences that it became a real bonding experience. And one thing I learned first with the Narrowgate series, and then triply so with this, was that the bill for that relationship building comes due in the writing process. And I think that it does ultimately make for a better finished project. But after 6 months of crying on the phone with people, sitting down to actually draft this, I was kind of paralyzed by the desperate need to make sure that they would recognize their stories on my page. There's nothing more mortifying to me than the thought of like having these really intimate conversations and then sensationalizing somebody's story in a way that they wouldn't recognize it on the page. So suddenly you have all these conversations, you think, we have this huge story here, and you sit down to write it and you're just thinking of all those sources, not as sound bites, but as real people who really shared something with you. And so that's a very long way of saying that this was a pretty intimate process for both me and sources that required a lot of trust on both sides, and particularly theirs, and a lot of vulnerability on both sides, and particularly theirs. And I'm just grateful that they gave me that opportunity.
Thank you. And Logan, in your investigation of Wommack and Charis, you heard from several former students who felt that his ministry was originally spiritually nourishing, but then began to change. Does your research support the idea that his ministry was less harmful in the beginning?
Yes and no. This is one I have really wrestled with. I want to break this down into two categories. So the question is, was it ever less harmful? A lot of people I spoke to felt that it was. If we break this down into two categories, I think we get a slightly better look at what's going on. So our first category is going to be operational, what they do, and our second category is going to be ideological, what they say, what they believe. On the operational side, what the day-to-day looks like, how people are treated interpersonally, how leaders in the organization behave, it has demonstrably gotten worse over the last 5 to 7 years. There was first a big corporate reorganization, then there were some major debt issues, and the ministry also grew by about 300%. And going through all of that, there was turnover in leadership, a new set of values kind of took hold where it's growth at all costs, money at all costs. And that really did, both from documentary evidence I've very much found, and from the testimony of a dozen sources, that very much worsened the experience on campus. People talk about a very cruel culture that really dominates Charis these days. That truly does seem to have worsened. So on the operational side, I do think there's truth to the fact that it was perhaps more nurturing at some point, at least interpersonally, and that has declined. On the ideological or theological side, I don't know that we can cut that slack, frankly. Some of these teachings, these prosperity gospel messages of health and wealth and healing, right, should really bear an unsafe at any level warning label. These are teachings that really harm people, and here's what I mean by that. There's this idea that Andrew Wommack and other prosperity gospel pastors are very big on, that if you have enough faith, you will be granted health and wealth. You'll be given prosperity by the Lord, your illness will be healed, etc. And of course, when you don't have those things, or your illness is not healed, you are also being told that you don't have enough faith. And that's a pretty rough thing to be told right after your cancer diagnosis. Or money. It's also rough to be told things that Wommack has told people, like that the devil cannot make you sick without you cooperating. So you cannot have cancer without also being a handmaid to the devil. He has told people in crowds that they can simply choose to not have cancer if they have enough faith. It's easy to sort of laugh at these things as being ridiculous, but I want you to imagine being the person with cancer and the very sincere belief that this man could heal you and is instead effectively condemning you because you have cancer. These teachings destroy people emotionally and spiritually and frankly, sometimes physically. There are more than a couple stories out of Charis of people who have turned their back on their doctor-recommended treatment programs and died, at least one on campus. So this is something with very, very real consequences for people who turn their back on medical care, but it is also something that has enormous emotional and psychological consequences for people who simply have normal struggles in life and are being told at every turn that if they had enough faith, they would not have those struggles. So the spiritual leaders they are looking to are also the ones telling them that they're not worthy. So while the operational side has coarsened, has gotten a lot worse, I have also heard from people who were at Charis or with Wommack Ministries 20, 30 years ago and still felt harmed by those teachings, if not interpersonally by fellow students and leaders. So it's a long way of saying yes and no.
Yeah, I'm reminded these ideas aren't new, these dynamics aren't new. At the school that I mentioned earlier, many people didn't have a lot of money who were supporting the ministry, very devoted. And yet I remember very clearly the day that they drove a BMW into the church sanctuary to give to the pastor. I remember the climates of not confessing weakness because somehow that lacked spiritual maturity. I remember the climate of denying your physical health and your mental health because so much of it was wrapped into this pseudo-strength is how I think about it. And so that leads to this next question, which is the topic of spiritual abuse. And so we're heading into some really hard territory, but important territory, which is why I think shining this light is critical at this time. The term spiritual abuse is not something that a lot of people are familiar with. People who have been raised in good faith organizations where they've had the ability to critically think and grapple with things, question authority, and deal with all of the normal emotions of life. Perhaps it's a little less familiar, this notion of spiritual abuse, but you wrote about it in length in your series. So how did that operate? College, or how did that operate at Charis Bible College?
Dominantly. So we'll start with the definition here. I think the simplest definition of spiritual abuse is a pattern of behavior that involves using a person's spiritual or religious beliefs to control or harm them, control, manipulate, or harm them. That's obviously not specific to Charis or to Andrew Wommack. For a long time, this idea of spiritual abuse was kind of slept on in psychological circles. Over the last 10 or 15 years, though, there have been multiple studies that have shown a link between religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and complex PTSD, which has given it a lot more cachet in clinical circles, and it's something people are taking, I think, a bit more seriously now. It is also the very first thing that Tim McDermott, one of my primary sources for this series, I made a post on Reddit months before he and I ended up talking, basically a shout into the void looking for Charis folks. And the email that Tim first sent me in January or February was really about spiritual abuse. That's the first sort of cry that you put out, the first thing that you raised, and it's something that I dovetailed a lot with what I was already being told at that point. And as I worked through this series, it is something that virtually everybody I spoke to came back to, is that while not unique to Charis, spiritual abuse has become a very standard mode of operating at Charis, both student to student, leader to student, leader to leader. This willingness and desire to use one another's sincere beliefs to twist them into doing what they want them to do is effectively how Charis operates from stem to stern. It is a series of emotionally and spiritually manipulative relationships feeding off one another, and it's leaving people absolutely devastated. One thing sources told me repeatedly is that you learn very quickly not to question leaders, not to express any discontentment with anything about Charis or Wommack Ministries, or you'll likely be accused of lacking faith or being a tool of Satan. And again, put yourself in the mindset of somebody who is so intent on pursuing their Christian faith that they have moved to a Bible college in the middle of nowhere. And then their leaders are telling them, because they had a concern or they had a question, that they very well might be tools of Satan, and they're definitely lacking faith. And what they really need to do is shut up and shove those concerns down. That would be the most faithful thing that they can do, is to stop rocking the boat. And for people who have come to this place to earnestly strengthen their faith, having that faith weaponized against them by the faith leaders they have come to trust is both remarkably effective and remarkably harmful. And one thing I have heard from source after source and seen is that once they have gotten out of this environment, rebuilding their ability to trust their own instincts and to trust their own judgment is a massive hurdle, because for so long they are told that the most faithful thing they can do is ignore it, shove it down, and listen to what their superiors are saying. And so there's this real reformation of who you are as a person that so many of these sources had to do after leaving, which is essentially a downstream effect of this overwhelming culture of spiritual abuse.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, spiritual abuse was not the only kind of abuse that you uncovered at Charis. What other kinds of abuse, whether emotional, financial, physical, did you find when interviewing former Charis students and staff members?
I talked earlier about how I felt that the Narrowgate series kind of prepared me to carry the weight of some difficult personal stories for people, and then to really do my best to do justice to those stories. This is what was so difficult about the Charis story, was talking to people about abuse that they have endured. A lot of that was spiritual abuse, and I think to people who haven't experienced it, that can feel a little bit wishy-washy. I can assure you, as somebody who has both experienced it, spoken to many people who have, it's not. But if it is a little bit too insubstantial for you, I think we also want to talk a little bit here about financial abuse, and a little bit here about physical abuse as well. There is a whole aspect of financial abuse at Charis, and it functions in a couple ways, but I think the way that it's important to zoom in on here is how it functions in the healing ministry and in their claims of supernatural healing. I think it's also important to keep this contextualized as an extension of the spiritual abuse. They're once again preying on what you believe in order to affect your behavior in a way that they would like. And what I mean by that is, look, Andrew Wommack makes extraordinary claims to faith healing. He claims to have raised his own son from the dead. He claims to have raised others from the dead. You are some would say that that was Narcan, indeed. I cannot personally assert that. But yes, claims to have raised his son from the dead. He claims to have restored sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, everything, curing cancer all the time. And those teachings go hand in hand with Wommack as well as with many, many prosperity gospel preachers and faith healers, with the implication that the best way to prove your faith is to give money to a ministry. It's not saying give money to our ministry, but there's a teaching of reaping and sowing, basically. And you need to put out there, if you have enough faith to contribute more to a ministry than you can actually afford, like God will register that faith, and that's gonna work out for you. You'll either get the money back or you'll get this, that, or the other. Sources I have spoken to for this series described a very real problem of those claims seeming to have a pretty serious impact on a large network of retirees and widows who consume Andrew Wommack's content around the country, many of whom have come here in last-ditch efforts to get healed, ended up spending their entire retirements, and then, in many cases, dying, which is a very sad series of events. And while I can't speak to anybody's motivations, of course, you see that there are folks who have profited quite a bit off of that series of events and off of repeating that series of events, of drawing people here with hopes of healing, heavily implying that giving money is going to help bring that healing for them, and then they're out of money and still sick. This has happened more than a few times in this community. And that was very hard to hear about as well. What about the widows? What about the orphans, right? I think it is also very important to note that Andrew Wommack would never, ever, ever be so blunt as to say, you give me money, I give you healing. It would never function like that. And so there's a great deal of plausible deniability. So while he would not say, give us money and you will be healed, he would say and has said that giving money demonstrates your faith, and he would say and has said that the faithful will be healed. People are left to do the math themselves. So the financial abuse, that's a very real element. And when we see that this is a ministry that is struggling with millions and millions of dollars in debt, you can understand their incentive to do that. We're not talking about cartoon villains here. We're talking about people who really do think that what they're doing is, for the most part, right. And if pouring money into that ministry, getting the money for that ministry is what's going to allow it to flourish, they do seem to believe that that is worth it. The idea of the ends justifying the means is something that many, many sources brought up as well, and I think we see that here. So there's the spiritual abuse, there's the financial abuse, and then I won't get too far ahead of myself here because I think we're going to get into it a little bit more, but hardest of all was that many, many women who have been part of this community came from, not this community, the Charis/Wommack community, came forward and talked to me about what they described as a very serious, very widespread problem of domestic abuse in the Charis and Wommack ministry circles. And we're not talking about something like the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal where there were really official organs of the church doing some of this. We're talking more about a culture bred by the teachings of this ministry and then ignored because of the teachings of this ministry and essentially allowed to fester to the point that they sometimes take lives. But I believe we're going to talk about this a little bit more, so I don't want to barrel too far ahead.
No, just we would love to know, for the sake of being educated on not only the implications for community, but for individuals. What are some of the most heartbreaking stories that you uncovered in your investigation?
Absolutely. On a general level, this problem of domestic abuse, this was the biggest part of this series that I didn't see coming. Before I started interviewing people, like I said, I consumed pretty much everything in the public record about this organization. I had known from doing that both of Andrew Wommack's sons have been arrested multiple times for pretty serious domestic violence. But I had not, yes, one of them in fact was jailed for a number of years for beating his then fiance so severely that medical staff thought that she might die. So I had known that there was a problem of domestic violence in his family. I had not seen any indication that it was really plaguing his community as well. And when I spoke to the first woman who really told me about this, I was truly taken aback. I knew, oh, they're doing this political stuff, this prosperity gospel stuff, not great either. This really put us into a different territory altogether. And it was the hardest and also most moving part of this was having these women who had been so strong and so brave to leave share those stories with me and trust me to tell them. To the rest of your question, like I've already sort of implied, domestic violence issue is seemingly very, very widespread at Charis. It's both because of teachings of wives submitting to their husbands, of course, and pretty traditional gender roles. It is also, however, fueled by this not quite Andrew Wommack specific belief, but a belief that he touts quite a bit, which is specifically the belief that staying with your abusive spouse is a great act of faith. So like giving the money so that you can be healed, staying with your abuser, it's another way to demonstrate that faith. I actually, in this series, published never before heard audio, recorded at the time by a student who was simply recording to go back and take notes later, but after leaving realized he had this in his possession. And it's audio of Andrew Wommack acknowledging that this teaching has been interpreted as telling women to stay in abusive marriages. And him basically saying, but whatever. He says that that's them misinterpreting it, and so he's just gonna keep saying it. And so what we saw there was essentially him acknowledging that he understands that his teaching is being taken like this, and that he intends to keep sharing those teachings, which struck me as a very cavalier disregard for the impact of his own words. And I found that really troubling. I also spoke to a woman in the ministry who went to the ministry. She had been a student and then she worked in the ministry for 10 years. She went to leaders in the ministry when she was in an abusive marriage about her abusive marriage, seeking counseling. She was told that she could only have counseling if her husband agreed to it and was present for it. So in other words, she could not seek counseling for her abusive marriage unless her abuser was present. She told me that a number of her friends had that exact same experience, where you approach the ministry for help in your abusive marriage and they require your abuser to sign off on that. That's obviously very, very dangerous, as well as entirely unhelpful. And then we have, to truly answer this story, what was the hardest, what was the most shocking part? That's the story of Adriana Trujillo. Some of y'all will remember that there was a murder-suicide in Florissant in November of 2022. Adriana Trujillo was the victim in that. Adriana, this is the worst case scenario, right? I spent a long time talking to her mother and her brother. And those conversations are still very raw for me, and I truly cannot imagine what they're going through. But Adriana came to Charis from New Mexico. She was in her late 20s when she got here in 2021. I believe she was 29. She showed up with her 2 young children from a previous relationship, about 4 and 6 years old at that time. At Charis, she came here, according to her brother, she wanted to set a good, she wanted to be a good role model for her children, show them that faith is important, that you can prioritize that in life. And they admittedly did not know much about the specifics of the beliefs and things like that, but she wanted to pursue her faith in a deeper way and set that example for her young children. So she came here in 2021 and became a student and started working at AWMI, at Andrew Wommack Ministries. That's where she met and fell in love with Sean Mills. Even as Sean's behavior was erratic, they fell in love and got married, and Adriana very quickly became pregnant. At one point over Memorial Day weekend in 2022, the first time he got particularly physically abusive, she left and she went back home to Rio Rancho, New Mexico with her family. That's the last time most of her family members ever saw her. It's the last time they will ever see her. She was encouraged to come back, to have some faith, show some faith by staying in her marriage. Other sources told me that during this time, Adriana reached out to the ministry for help and was presumably, they were not in those conversations, but sources felt it was most likely that she was told the same thing that these other women were told, which was basically, we'll talk to you about this if you bring your abuser with you. She wanted to make it work. She was pregnant with her third child. She came home after that Memorial Day and did her best to faith it out. In early October, she gave birth to a son, Zion. 6 weeks later, when she was breastfeeding him, Sean killed her, and then he killed himself. The way that the ministry responded to that internally, according to a number of sources, was to tell people not to talk about it, or else to be concerned for their future employment with the ministry. They were immediately very, very concerned about keeping the lid on it as a PR problem. They approached Adriana's family with $10,000. They very quickly set out to do that, and then they held, and this is still such an seen as such an insult by Adriana's mother, Lynette, is that they then at Charis held a joint memorial for Sean and Adriana. He killed her. The way that the ministry handled this internally did drive a couple of my other sources out, including the woman I had spoken about who had been working there for 10 years. She briefly hoped, she knew Adriana, they had worked in the call center together, she briefly hoped that Adriana's tragic murder would be a catalyst for change for this very well-known internally and well-understood internally problem of domestic violence in the community. When it became clear almost immediately that it was not going to be that, she essentially packed her bags and left after more than 10 years, and others trickled out after that. Not only because they saw that these teachings, which they had attempted to raise alarms about internally, had actually contributed to the claiming of a life, they then saw that the ministry internally didn't seem to care other than how it would impact them from a PR standpoint. That's about the darkest thing I have seen out of Charis. It's not only this poor woman's tragic death and then holding a joint memorial with her abuser and murderer, but then threatening employees to stay quiet about it. That is not the way that a church or ministry should behave. I will also say, as a last word on that, the denouement of Adriana's tragic story does have a very small silver lining. She had 3 children, including Zion, who was 6 weeks old when she was killed. All 3 of them are now with her family in Rio Rancho. Her older daughter and son are being raised by her mother, Lynette, and Zion has been adopted by her cousin, who she was very close to, and who he and his wife have had fertility issues for a number of years and are now raising Zion as their own. So the fact that in the wake of this horrible tragedy, that those 3 beautiful children did not end up in the system, I think is a small but super important mercy that I think really moves me. This family had something taken from them, but they weren't going to let those kids be taken from them either. When they came up here to finish custody, hearing stuff about that, at some point last year, Charis had sent some sort of representative to the courtroom, and Adriana's parents asked the judge to make that person leave, and they did. I do not know more about that because nothing ended up happening, but even when they came to finalize here in Teller County Court custody arrangements for those children, there was somebody from Charis who showed up, and they were rubbed quite the wrong way by that. So forgive my very long-winded answer, but that story has hung with me for months now, and I expect will hang with me for a very, very long time.
Very troubling. Logan, I'm wondering if you could unpack a bit more, because in your article you talk about some of the toxic patterns in the culture of Charis, this culture of positive confessions, of always needing to put on a good face, of always projecting this form of strength or faith, as Charis would teach about it. How does that contribute to some of these harms that you've been discussing? What are some of those connections?
If I'm understanding you correctly, so I think that some of the spiritual abuse in this dominant culture. Actually, before I just riff, do you want to give me that question one more time?
Yeah, no problem. So the question is, more succinctly, how does the toxic culture lead to these forms of horrific abuse that you have discussed? What are some of the dynamics at play?
That is, in fact, a very good question. Look, one of the very first things you will hear from anybody who has spent time at Charis and left is that it's not okay to not be okay. You need that smile on your face all the time. You need to be too blessed to be stressed. I think it was Tim's mom who first told me the phrase that I know would make me lose my mind if someone ever said it to me, which is she once said to somebody that she was doing all right under the circumstances, and that person said to her, "What are you doing under the circumstances?" I'd have been expelled that day. But that's sort of a funny story to exemplify that it's truly not okay to not be okay. You need to be full of that spirit all the time. You need to be happy, peppy, smiling, laughing, visibly so, or else people will question your faith. It's not okay to not be okay. It's not really okay to be sick either, to the extent that people hide illnesses. I was told about I don't want to keep name-checking Tim, but this is also a Tim quote in the story. Tim talked about a family who essentially, I believe it was one of their sons had been healed, and when the mother became ill, there was a serious reticence to let anybody know that, because then they would go from a healed family to not that, which would damage their social cachet in that culture, because they're the big faithy ones because they had a previous healing, and to then acknowledge that you have some sort of illness, that's going to take you off that pedestal, and not subtly. Like, people will notice. People will comment on it to you. And that's something that I was actually quite surprised by in talking to a lot of sources, was the number of digs that people will throw your way because you have the flu or a single bad day or things like that. People will really tell you, you got to get your faith up, you know? Which just doesn't, it feels very, everybody's always being watched and they need to be putting on a very specific performance. And it cuts them off from normal human experience. It also, if say you are a victim of abuse or some kind or another, it completely shuts down your avenues to be able to talk about that to anybody, especially if the person mistreating you is in leadership, because then you're 2 strikes down. You're not only voicing discontentment about the organization, you're voicing discontentment about leadership. 2 things that only somebody lacking in faith would do, right? So it is a very oppressive, it keeps them very bound in exactly the mode that the organization wants them to be in, and venturing outside of that is essentially reason for punishment, ostracization, or something else. And so essentially, the culture lets these things continue to thrive, because if you are, for instance, even forget about the teaching that staying in your abusive marriage is a good way to demonstrate faith. Even if they're not teaching that, but they are teaching the rest, how are you going to speak up about your abusive marriage? How is that not being under the circumstances, right? And so it enforces silence more than anything. Silence about anything that is not good.
Yeah. Again, reminds me, Charis, Wommack Ministries, and some of these similar groups have this belief in demons and demons infesting individuals. And it reminded me of a story when I was at the Bible school of being physically assaulted because the spiritual leader believed that I had a demon within me, which then led to some signs of post-traumatic stress. And I remember walking around that Bible school with my head bowed a lot in sort of shame. And I remember leaders would say, "Buck it up." I needed to demonstrate this strength and this inability to accept human experiences and whatnot has an impact not only on a person's physical being, but it also can impact their faith. And so what is your takeaway when speaking with former Charis students regarding how they now think about Christianity or their spirituality in general?
This has been to me, maybe not to y'all, but this has been to me one of the most interesting parts. Like I've said a couple times, I'm truly deeply interested in what people believe and why they believe those things. And so this actual nexus of where this narrative intersects with the personal beliefs of my sources was fascinating. It is universally true that their encounters with Charis changed the trajectory of their faith. Beyond that, it changed it in a number of different ways, sort of depending on where people were coming from, where they were going. A number of sources have lost their faith and left organized religion entirely since departing Charis, and have rebuilt lives for themselves on value sets that they have chosen and feel some degree of ownership over. Others have stayed, have maintained their faith, but have switched to doctrinally very different kinds of Christianity. And that's what has been so interesting to me. I was talking to Rodney about this right before. So I was raised in the Reformed tradition of Christianity. So Calvinists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, the dour sort. I didn't see somebody raise their hands in worship for the first time until I was in 6th grade, and I was shocked. I was like actually shocked. I thought, this is crazy. This is Michael W. Smith's daughter? I don't know. That's an in reference to anybody who gets it.
Friends are friends forever. Yeah.
Yes. So sort of a more Northern European form of Christianity, if you will. And the Reformed tradition is very different from the Pentecostal charismatic tradition. I think to say nothing particularly good or bad about either, they are just about as far from each other as they can get, while both truly being legitimate forms of Christianity that are not, new religious movements. These are accepted as orthodox forms of Christianity, but they're remarkably different. At Charis and in charismatic and Pentecostal circles, everything is very experiential and emotional. That's what charismata effectively originally means, the gifts of the Spirit. That's where charismatic comes from, it's where Charis comes from. And so this experience of the holiness of the Lord and really feeling it. Again, I didn't see somebody raise their hands in worship until I was in 6th grade, and that's as a pastor's kid being at church about 3 times a week. That you can see is not a particularly experiential or emotional form of Christianity. It is instead a very almost academic, very literary form of Christianity. And so these different strains of Christian practice have kind of erred in opposite directions of one another. And I think that for people looking to practice and understand their Christian faith, there are probably things from both of those buckets that they could grab and maybe do something perhaps a little bit more syncretic than either of these groups are traditionally doing. But that's a long way of saying that there were a ton of sources I talked to who came out of Charis and eventually became Reformed. So they left their emotional, experiential Christianity and went to a sort of academic, intellectual access to the Word of God, right? What's also fascinating that I learned from talking to other people is that there are plenty of people who came out of Reformed Christianity into Charis. And so there's this interesting push-pull between, that's so interesting to me as somebody who's raised in the Reformed tradition, has really studied the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, is, yeah, they're pretty much opposites while both being Bible-believing Christianity. And so it's been really interesting to see the extent of that reaction, either from people leaving Reformed tradition to seek Charis or leaving Charis to seek a Reformed tradition. But regardless of what these sources now believe in terms of their faith, they did have a lot in common because of what they had all been through. And one thing I found amongst these sources, whether they're believers now or not believers now, whether they're still angry or they feel particularly healed, it was a great degree of self-awareness and self-knowledge of the kind you can kind of only get from needing to piece yourself back together after outsourcing a lot of your judgment for many years. And so this is not the case with sources for every story, right? Sometimes there's a lot of hand-holding, but I found so many of these folks with fully formed observations, and they had really spent time working through all of this to try to piece themselves back together after leaving this group. And it made for a series of, I think, remarkably well-spoken and self-assured people who no longer had, it was almost like they had already gone through all of the fear that they were willing to experience about Charis and about Andrew Wommack. and showed up as sources ready to just go for it, come what may. And so I've been fascinated by their faith journeys and how different they've been, but I've also been fascinated by almost a similar personality so many of them seem to have developed by virtue of going through this and realizing that they could survive.
Thank you. Logan, if you want to touch on anything else regarding the high control nature of Wommack's Ministries, please feel free. Or also talk to the audience a little bit about politics and how politics plays into that, or any connection between those two.
Absolutely. So this is not a bombshell. It might upset some of you, I don't know. I don't think that it is accurate at the end of the day to call Charis Bible College a cult. I think it is 100% accurate to call Narrowgate, that we talked about earlier, a cult. The difference of degrees between those things matter. I will also say, it would not be accurate to say that this is just another Bible college or just another ministry. The rubric I have used for myself in my head, because I cannot resist a catchy turn of phrase, is that they are neither Baptists nor Branch Davidians. This is not just the church down the street, and this is not a doomsday cult. When we look at the BITE model again, behavior, information, thought, and emotion, we do see some degree of control exerted over all four of those by Charis. But if you look at virtually any belief system, you will see some exertion of influence over all four of those, because that's what belief is, right? It influences your behavior, your thoughts, and your emotions at the very least. And so through that lens, I don't think we can say that Andrew Wommack Ministries or Charis is a cult. I do think that we can remain wary, and I do think that there are aspects of being a high control group that they are already checking the boxes on. Another term or rubric that people use in talking about this is the total institution. Total institutions are places where large numbers of people live and work together in closed, formally administered systems cut off from the wider community. They are not, however, always cults. In fact, the classic examples of total institutions are monasteries and orphanages. But many cults are also total institutions by virtue of that place where a large number of people live and work together in a closed, formally administered system cut off from the wider community. So while I think that Charis and AWMI are escaping the definition of cult right now, one thing I do think that it's important for this community to be wary of is, as the planned expansion continues, as they build more housing on campus, indeed, as they build more housing on campus, as they're able to sort of live more fully up there together, I think that those risk factors for total institutions are going to escalate. Once there is less necessary day-to-day interaction with the lovely people of this town, because they're all living secluded on campus, I think that that is something to be concerned about. It's not where we are right now. But we're also not just talking about the church down the street. So, and it's a somewhat unsatisfying answer, I think. We are dealing with kind of dangerous shades of gray. I do not in any way want to pretend that simply because I do not believe that this group can honestly meet the criteria for being a cult, I do not want in any way that to imply that they have not caused harm, are not currently causing harm, and are not something to keep an eye on as we go into the future. They are.
And we're hearing a lot today about this term Christian nationalism, which I think requires a definition. Can you talk a little bit about Christian nationalism and how Andrew Wommack Ministries aligns or does not align with common perceptions of that term?
I've been known to discuss Christian nationalism from time to time. So I'll give you again the sort of simple definition I like to use here, which is a movement which seeks to merge American identity with Christian identity and believes that the Bible should play a leading role in the formation of laws. It's what our experts like our friend Sam Perry and his co-author Andrew Whitehead have called a political theology. And I love that terminology for it, because it's not a set of doctrinal beliefs, right? You have Reformed people who are Christian nationalists, right next to charismatic Pentecostal people who are Christian nationalists, right next to those Baptists I keep mentioning for no reason. Look, when you're raised in the South, in the church, this is a digression, Baptists are just kind of either you're Baptist or they are the example you use for everything your denomination doesn't like, right? So having two parents who were both raised in the Southern Baptist Church and then both left it, this is exactly what it sounded like growing up in my house. Nobody can get through like 6 sentences without being like, those damn Baptists. So I apologize. I have nothing against Baptists. But my mom does. So a political theology, it's not about these doctrinal beliefs. It really is about a way of seeing the United States and a way of building political power. It is a political coalition. And within that coalition, you get groups that are also dedicated to what we call the Seven Mountains Mandate. And some of y'all are going to be familiar with that. For those who aren't, you're going to see me turn a page here because I can never ever remember all seven in one go, which is horrible of me. They're the seven mountains of society are family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, which is two, I know, business, and government. So those are the seven mountains of society that they say. The belief is that Christians should be dominant in all seven of those categories to bring the nation back to God, and in some interpretations, in some people's interpretations, to bring about the return of Jesus Christ and the end of the world. So conquering those seven mountains, what they mean by that is having Christian figures dominant in all seven of those areas of society, exerting influence over those seven areas of society. The reason I think people in Woodland Park are somewhat familiar with this is that you have been living it. It's truly not a fluke or a conspiracy that this organization ran an entire slate of city council candidates earlier this year, trying to bring new influences into the, quote, mountain of government. And it is not a fluke that in 2021, this organization backed a slate of school board candidates, bringing new influences into that, quote, mountain of education. And it is why when NBC was here last year, they showed up early, right, to get all of the seats in a school board meeting, leaving district parents out in the rain for the TV cameras, by the way, which I'm not sure a PR expert would have approved of, regardless. Be like, oh, we left our poor opponents out in the rain. Don't they look sympathetic? Right. But the reason they were able to get so many people to show up to do something like that is because this is a very sincere part of their belief system, that these things must be conquered, and that they must be conquered for the Lord. You don't have to accept this, and I certainly don't accept like the legitimacy of it, but your average person who showed up to that protest last year at the school board, they didn't see that as a mean or aggressive thing to be doing. They saw it as ministry, and they see taking over the town as ministry. In their eyes, this is completely justified. They do not see themselves as in any way trying to pull a fast one on y'all. They're going to bring this town to the Lord one way or another, damn it, right? They believe that that is a good thing, to take over your institutions and remake them in their image. I don't know how else to put this other than that it's not, as much as it sounds like some sinister political plot, and as much as on some levels it is, it's also understood by them very simply as an outworking of their faith, which demands that they seize control of secular institutions. And unfortunately, y'all have been a testing ground for that. The idea is not that if Andrew Wommack can control Woodland Park, suddenly the entire country changes. The idea is that the more groups, the more adherents to the Seven Mountains Mandate have control over crafting policy at city councils or at school boards or at things like that, the sooner they have the ability to influence not towns but cities, and not cities but states, and not states but the country. It's all about creating a model. That's why we are seeing attempts to export American birthright to every school district and its brother. It hasn't worked virtually anywhere else yet, but they did that here first because they could, and they're working very, very hard to make it happen elsewhere. And the last thing I'll tell you on that front is we don't have to assume that the plan is to export it. Not only has there been a good deal of talk about that, first it's Woodland Park. What is the clip, Nicole? He then says, figured we'd set our sights on the state of Colorado. There's already been talk about sort of expanding from the local level to the state level. And unfortunately, just in the last week, I received emails from a few folks in a different state where a Charis graduate is in a position of local government authority in a local town in Washington state and is pushing almost exactly the same stuff that has happened here. So, it is being exported. It is being tested here and it is being exported. And there is currently a new woodland park cropping up in Washington state. And I need to talk some more to those folks. I literally received emails about this last Friday from a couple people. And it's because essentially this fellow who is a sheriff in this area in Washington state, he ended up sending out an email that finally name-checked Charis as his alma mater. And so a lot of people who had been like, what is going on with this guy, then put some of that together, which is why these folks all sort of reached out to me at once. But other to say, I know it sounds like this crazy political conspiracy. It's also just a thing that's actually happening and that they don't feel is a crazy political conspiracy. They just think it's their faith and the practice of their faith. So that's a very hard thing to stand against, but I think that we will probably close here in a minute on talking about how some of that is possible.
Yeah, and it reminds me, though Andrew Wommack, I know, does not claim to be part of these new apostolic Reformation networks, there are charismatic informed leadership networks that began in the mid-90s under a gentleman named C. Peter Wagner that have lots of connections with Andrew Wommack Ministry, a gentleman named Lance Wallnow, who's on the board for Truth and Liberty Coalition. And I bring that up because there are three distinctives of this NAR movement, which is this idea of contemporary or modern prophets and apostles that not only govern churches, but also regions, governmental spheres. An idea of dominionism, some of what we've heard regarding this Christian nationalist influence, but this part of the movement, which I know Wommack's ministry believes and propagates, is this idea of spiritual warfare, this idea of demonology, and this idea of really accentuating the others who are perceived to be a threat not only to society, to themselves, but to the very social fabric of the United States. And people are quite literally demonized, not just in a metaphorical sense, but in a sense of that individual, LGBTQ, for example, is infested with demons, and therefore, if those ideas are then brought into other ways that policy is implemented, I see that as a real problem, while at the same time recognizing that Christians have the religious freedom and the right to believe, for example, on gender and sexuality, according to the dictates of their conscience. But does Andrew Wommack Ministries believe that? And if they're influencing policy, what does that mean for your neighbors who don't align with your particular conquest-oriented faith? So with that being said, Logan, to close us up, for those who don't want Woodland Park to simply be reduced to a political enclave and a bedroom for Charis, otherwise known as Wommack Park, and quite concerning that we're seeing this in other parts of the country, where I've even heard reports of pastors who are now training their members in kind of militia type things.
Greg Locke.
How do we ensure that Woodland Park and other places in the country that are influenced by this have a voice in the political process? What can we do to intervene on behalf of people of faith and people of no faith?
That is obviously the question. Look, every time I'm here, I think I say something like, organize, vote, build community. And those things are important, right? There's also an important time to talk about the actual mechanics of power and our institutions and how communities can protect their cherished institutions from an organization which has openly pledged to take them over. That's why I think the city council races earlier this year were a really big deal. And it's clearly why Charis thought they were a really big deal and ran an organized slate. And I know that certain longer-term decisions were made by past councils. There are certain things that can't be undone, right? But Charis is aware that it absolutely needs local government in order to keep growing. It needs, student housing doesn't zone and build itself, and utilities and emergency services do not fund and extend themselves. Those are decisions that have to be made by somebody. And to be perfectly clear, the plan, this takeover that has been talked about, it is not separate from the building of student housing. The plan is to build enough housing to outnumber you. This is not something they're particularly secretive about. They want to bring enough people here and grow the student body enough that your voices are secondary to theirs because they can vote for the whole town how they want it to. They're not there yet, numbers-wise. They're a few thousand off, and that's why we saw, obviously, they lost all 4 of those city council races and the mayoral race. But that sort of local government planning approval, that is something that they are very, very acutely aware of their need for. And when earlier this year, the voters of Woodland Park decided to reject a Charis-controlled or even Charis-influenced city council, I think that makes it perfectly within the bounds of fairness, democracy, and polite society for the newly elected city council to take a more skeptical approach to Charis and Andrew Wommack's organizations than past city councils did. Y'all won. You need to lobby your local leaders when these decisions come up. You are not under any obligation to subsidize your own takeover. You are not under any obligation to continue extending zoning and to continue extending emergency services and to continue extending utility access for the group that is wanting those things extended so that they can bring enough people here to outvote you. You are not under any obligation to do that. There was an election, they lost. It is perfectly reasonable for this council to take a more skeptical and more critical approach than past ones have. And I believe that y'all should encourage them to do that. That is well within your right. It is not impolite. It is nothing of the sort. Elections matter. Make this one matter. And lastly, obviously organize, build community, and vote. The things that I always say. But the community bit is really, really important. I have had the great fortune over the last several months to build relationships with a lot of people who spent a lot of time at Charis. And I know that you probably assume this on the surface, but it's different in real life when you learn that they're actually just like us in a lot of ways, like normal people who somewhere along the line fell into something a little unfortunate, as so many of us have in different ways, and who eventually down the line, many of them fall out of it or leave it and go on about their lives. There's this thing we don't talk about a lot where, did you know that the majority of opioid addicts survive and get clean and never touch another drug? We don't talk about that a lot. About 70% of opioid addicts get clean and go on to live healthy, normal lives. But it's not how we conceive of them, right? I don't think it's necessarily how we're conceiving of Charis people. We think that this is what they are, how they are, set in stone. Tim McDermott's sitting right there. He traveled across the world to study and then work at this institution, and then spent months helping me write, frankly, the most critical thing that has ever been written about it. And both of those things were difficult for him, and he did both of them. And that is to say, you seeing them at the grocery store, the nod you can give them in the checkout line, that little bit of kindness. There are people who have been in there and who have left. And there are people in there right now who are thinking about leaving and do not know what kind of world is going to greet them. Be a kind face. You won't regret it. It won't cost you anything. It can make a difference in their life. And ultimately, it can make a difference in your town, because if this organization is shrinking instead of growing, it becomes a lot harder to outvote all of you. And so that's just my kind of trite way of saying, make a Charis friend. You might be surprised. You don't have to condone what they're trying to do or everything that they believe. I have not regretted the relationships I have built with people who have given large portions of their life to Charis. I have learned a lot from them. And the main thing that I have learned is that there are other people there right now who are trying to psych themselves up to make the jump to leave. And each of y'all can make that a little easier. It's not your responsibility to do so. especially when you're in this sort of aggrieved, put upon position of being the ones being taken over. But I promise you that it can really matter to somebody, and that those people can not only cease being ones working against you, but could ultimately become ones working with you. That matters a lot, and it's something I would encourage each of you to keep in mind, because it goes a long way. You never know which of them is planning to leave.
Heartfelt thanks to Logan for being with us today.
Thank you, Maisie. Nicole? Did you slide the little button up?
Technical difficulties. There we go. Alrighty. Can we get one more round of applause for these two? I guess I'll come here. It is hot up here. All right, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. And during this time, if you have not already been handed a slip of paper, the ushers will pass around pencils and question forms for all of you to fill out one question that you would like to ask either Jonathan or Logan. And so there's a few instructions that I'm just going to rattle off real quick. Please put your full name, email address, name of the speaker that your question is for, and then write your question. Kind of self-explanatory. But there's a few other things. Only one question, please, per person. Once one question has been asked and answered, please do not ask it again. And then we're gonna go for no random commentary as well. Just try and keep things like nice and controlled. And then
I'll try.
I know, it's this one that we're worried about. And then as soon as the break is over, the question forms will go back into a basket. I'm then going to take the basket and pull them out at random. If I call your name, you're gonna come up down here. I will be down there with you. Ask it into the mic. You can stand up here while they answer it, or you can go back to your seat, and then that's it. Cool? All right, we'll see you guys in 5 minutes. All righty. Let's get going here. So I know I said that if your name is called, we'll stand down there. Plans have changed. If you don't mind coming up on the stage with us, that would be fantastic. So the first name is just John. So I don't know who John is. Oh, it's our cameraman. Our cameraman's going to come up on the stage. Okay, John, what's your question?
Is there any room for Charis in this town?
I mean, look, I am not the taxpayer of Woodland Park. I would say, yeah, that is also true. I would say that there is a way that organizations like this and towns like this can coexist, because there are many towns that have religious organizations in them that are not the same thing that the majority of the town believes in. This relationship has been pretty soured by actions taken by that ministry. And for instance, I've talked to many of you over the last couple of years who would have been perfectly happy to coexist, but once takeover talk started, that's a different animal entirely, because you're not trying to be taken over, and that's not something you can be made to sign up for. I think it's perfectly possible for organizations like Charis and towns like Woodland Park to coexist. With the way that this relationship has already been damaged, I think that a road back to that is probably a long one. It's not impossible. Any number of things can change as leadership switches out of the organization, if anything comes of that. You never know what the future holds. But as one of my sources said, in order to sort of become a healthier institution, Charis doesn't need to stop doing what it's doing. It needs to turn 180 degrees and start running in the opposite direction of what it's doing. And I don't think that you can sort of be compelled to totally get along with an organization that has not put any care or effort into getting along with you and has instead declared its intent to wage a hostile takeover of the town. So again, yes and no. In this particular instance, I think it's going to take some work, and I think a lot of that work needs to come from Charis more than it needs to come from rank and file townspeople.
Thank you for your question, John. All right, next up. Sheila? Yeah, please, if you don't mind.
Whenever we don't give questioners microphones, people start yelling like, "Oh, I can't hear you." You know, it's yeah.
Yeah, and we've got people watching on the live stream, and I know they like to see, who's asking the question. Hi, by the way. You did so well. Okay, so it's either, so you can.
Okay, this goes to either one of you. Sure. Is that better? All right. I love the coffee shops in this town. And from what I understand, two are owned by families who go to Charis, and one is owned by Charis. So one, is that true? Two, do I have to give up going to my favorite coffee shops? And three, how much money goes to Charis, the organization itself, if these people actually own the coffee shop, not Charis? And is this something are there a lot of shops around town that this is also an issue?
That is a good and very interesting question. There's part of it I can't answer. So there are two coffee shops in town owned by Charis families. I have not come across one being owned by Charis itself. And I think that might be some form of conflict with their tax-exempt status, but that has not necessarily stopped them before. In terms of whether or not you need to stop shopping there, I don't think so, right? It's not as if what you're spending on coffee is going to make a measurable difference in the $100 million annual budget of this organization. There's much larger pots of money going on. There are other businesses. Again, I would really like to map all this at some point. I haven't. But it's another outworking of that Seven Mountains mandate, right? One of those is business, getting as many of these folks sort of into Chamber of Commerce type settings and having influence over local economies. That's another thing that they really see as ministry. But of course, it can be ministry for you to interact with them there, right? We're all able to play our own 4D chess. John, do you have any insight here on, so the New Apostolic Reformation, these NAR groups, are very specifically keen on network building and this sort of thing, and so like having small business owners through town, that's something I think they would really value. But can you tell us a little bit more about how these things kind of manifest, or what some of that business aspect of the Seven Mountains has looked like in places?
Yes. So these Seven Mountains of conquest are different than someone riding in on a tank to take over, right? It's more as the folks that propagate this form of dominionism speak about it. I wouldn't quite say it's ground up, because there is a control, top-down authority of these mountains that they believe are necessary to conquer. And by the way, they believe these mountains are necessary to conquer because they believe that in much of America that demons actually hold sway over like territories of business and education and whatnot. And so in some of these groups, I can't speak specifically to Charis, but in Charis adjacent groups, there is this notion that super spiritualizes things to say, one, we need to combat with these territorial spirits in order to bring down the rulership of these seven mountains. But then, once we've done that, and often that's done through what they would call forms of intercessory prayer, speaking in tongues, those kind of things. But then there's this action part. So it's not the reformed part where God is sovereign over all, but we're sort of co-creators in this redemptive process. So I think that is an angle to understand about this Seven Mountain idea. But I would also say there is a strong, what's a word? The best word I have is mantra in some of these groups, that we as Christians are the persecuted ones. We're the ones that the big bad secular government is coming after. We're the ones who are being threatened. even as the leaders are making tons of money and taking over school boards and all of that. That's a strange tension there. But while I think Logan's point is really important about Charis maybe not fitting that quote-unquote cult definition strictly, there are cultic dynamics at play where people actually are trapped within these groups and do not feel like they have a way out because there are natural consequences, your social relationships, but there are also spiritual consequences for leaving these groups, including eternal hellfire, right? So we need to understand both the practical parts of this, but also the theology that mixes with the politics that influences this. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this, if people are trapped and they want to get out, because not everybody in these groups are perhaps being harmed. Not everyone has been subject to some of the abuses we've been talking about. Some people are living, relatively healthy lives, but for the ones who are not, who are being seriously harmed, psychologically and otherwise, it's a kind word. It's a kind interaction. It's a way that you can communicate to somebody else where all of a sudden they look at you and say, oh, maybe you're not the demon-infested enemy after all.
Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you for that question, Sheila.
Thank you, Maisie.
All right. Next question is Derek Norwood. He left. Cool. Never mind. I mean, should we still read it?
Let's see if it's good. Yeah, so basically, very quickly, it asks basically if based on my financial analysis of Wommack's organizations, whether or not I think they can achieve growth. Yeah, I mean, they're doing it. They are severely in debt, but they also have really high revenue. So they're spending more than they're bringing in, but they're bringing in $100 million a year, allegedly. Last we actually had evidence, it was about $70 million per year. That goes a long way in terms of sort of leveraging that to be able to, for instance, engage in construction. There is some internal concern that the construction costs might catch up to them, but I think that's projected to be a couple years off. So it just depends on if their financial picture changes between now and then. But they bring in a ton, they spend a ton. They're always bringing in enough to keep some things moving, but they're also deep enough in debt that game of musical chairs can't be played forever.
Yeah, and I mean, it's hard for us to even tell now that their tax designation has changed, so it's basically a black box. All right, Nate Dog. Oh, this is for you, Logan.
Cool. Oh yeah, it's a question from Maisie. What's up, girl?
Maisie. There you go.
Okay. Ooh. Do you think that Maisie? Sit down. Do you think that Andrew Wommack Ministries and Charis have crossed the line between a non-taxable church and a political entity which violates the Johnson Amendment?
Yes. Look, so for a long time, this question would have been a little bit harder to answer, and then they made it a lot easier earlier this year. All right, there is a ballot initiative on the Colorado ballot this November, which is to enshrine an access to abortion in our state constitution. We're already one of the most pro-choice states in the nation. This is essentially to lock it in, right? There's a campaign being run against that, of course. A couple months ago, AWMI gave $30,000 to that committee. Not Truth and Liberty, not a C4 organization. The ministry itself gave $30,000 to that political campaign. Nobody seems to have done anything about it yet. That is illegal. I think that there are some concerns about Truth and Liberty and how that works, Truth and Liberty being a C4. but all of the staff for Truth and Liberty is paid for with AWMI money. So all of the C4 political staff are paid for with the C3 money. That is also arguably unlawful. The IRS is terrified of enforcement actions against religious organizations, and they have been since something happened in Waco in 1994. And it's gotten worse and worse, and there's this real reluctance. And then there was this minor Obama-era IRS scandal about they're going after right-wing groups, but it turns out that was never the case. They were going after a bunch of C3s, and then Fox News selected the right-wing ones and made it this sort of, biased version of a story. But as a result, it kept the IRS back on their heels again, scared to touch anything that has to do with faith communities, despite having laws regulating them. So I'm not a tax expert. I'm not a lawyer either, but I've done a lot with political finance in my life, and I would have been fired for making some of the decisions they've made because they do truly seem to be unlawful.
Alrighty. Thank you, Nate. That was also by him. Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm not the best at reading cursive, even though I first was taught how to do it. Is that
Totally says
Linda? That's Linda. I thought it was a J. I was like, that what? Linda? Yeah, I know, that's why I was like, I know, it's like, that can't be right. I'm hallucinating. I still remember doing the sandpaper letters all big when I was a kid, but.
Give up. Thank you. According to a recent article in the Courier, Andrew Wommack is stepping back and 2 others are moving into the leadership role. How do you believe that this will affect Charis's efforts to control Woodland Park?
I think this is a very open question. For those of y'all who missed it, about a week after I published this series, Andrew Wommack announced that he would be stepping back from leadership of Charis Bible College, which we're certain is a coincidence. The thing that's complicated about that is whether or not it means anything. Right, so he's spiritual leader. I guess he always has been. So first of all, he says he's not retiring. And the reason he's insistent on phrasing it that way is because he has for a long time declared that he will never retire, which kind of boxes you in a little bit. So instead, he's stepping back and there will be a transition of leadership, but he will not be retiring. So there's a lot of sort of corporate jargon tied up in that anyway. But the bigger question is whether or not these organizations can in fact function without him as their figurehead, and whether or not he is willing to not be their figurehead. A couple years ago, the other side of the ministry ostensibly had the same thing. He was stepping back there, bringing in a board. The board was going to handle the day-to-day, all that sort of stuff. Everybody I've talked to says that the board is just a rubber stamp for Andrew Wommack. So he never actually went anywhere. He just kind of sidled off to the side a little bit, but is still 100% in control. The former COO told me that Andrew insists on approving $100 expenses. This is a $100 million a year organization. And that's on the side that he has already ostensibly stepped back from. So I don't really know that this means anything. At the same time, he's getting older. And he's not going to live forever. And if I were 75, I'd probably be about ready to go kick back somewhere too. So it's hard to really say what is happening. As to whether or not it'll impact their ability to take over the town, I think that's also very hard to say. So the woman slated to take over, Carrie Pickett, is and has been Andrew's closest acolyte for decades. She is the greatest thing he has ever made in his eyes. You can really, truly see him look on her with a real fatherly love. He's known her since she was about 10. She was one of the first Charis graduates in the 3rd graduating class. She then ran the Ministries outposts in Russia for about 12 years. And now she and her husband are back here sort of living at headquarters and running things there, where she's currently the dean of Charis. So these people are already in authority, and more to the point, Carrie Pickett is so truly a product of Andrew Wommack's teachings that I think it would be very difficult to say theoretically Andrew really is stepping aside and Carrie really will become in charge. It's very difficult to imagine that changing a whole bunch because she is as close to a true Charis product as you can get in the first place. It's not like somebody coming in from outside. It's somebody who's really been steeping in Andrew Wommack's teachings since she was 9 or 10 years old. So there's a lot that remains to be seen, but if she were actually to come in and become dominant, I don't know how much we could expect to see change. It was Flavor Aid.
Thank you, Linda, for that question. Okay, next question is from John Harness.
Oh, yeah. So you said they're not Baptists and they're not Branch Davidians, but there was, he's been quoted about a cache of weapons. So where does he stand with that?
Yes, what bothers me most about this is that I'm the only person who's ever reported it, and he just like straight up said it on a live stream. As a couple months ago, Andrew Wommack said, in conversation with Sheriff Mikesell, this is me holding back several thoughts while I'm in his jurisdiction. Anyway, so in conversation with Sheriff Mikesell, who I think we all know is a lovely public servant who nobody could say anything impeachable about, Wommack commented that up at Charis, they have more weapons than the local police department. He said that they are armed to the hilt. They do have armed guards all over campus. He seemed to be implying the existence of some sort of armory. I think he might have been lying. I've gone back and forth on this. There's this sort of known penchant, even amongst these people who like truly look up to him and worship him. There's a little bit of this known thing that if you just kind of let Andrew Wommack talk, he might end up saying something that causes some problems for the ministry. They used to have him on the phones as part of the phone ministry, and as one, I find this actually quite endearing. I apologize. A source who worked in the phone center for a long time told me that he used to do a shift on the phones for people calling in, but they had to pull him off of that because people would call for like financial help, and he'd be like, "You can't just spend all your money, then call me for prayer about it." Like he'd just sort of like be a little too honest with people, I think, about some of that. So there is this sort of known issue of like he plays to the camera, he plays to the audience a little bit, and maybe he's gonna say something, and sometimes it's about how like another civil war would be worth it, and sometimes it's about him saying that they have more weapons than the local police department. It's very hard to know what to make of that either way. John?
I just want to add, there are I want to say, it can, in these conversations, we can at times perhaps be interpreted as like bashing on charismatic Christians or Pentecostal-oriented Christians. And I want to clarify that there are many democracy-upholding believers of the charismatic and the Pentecostal variety. But in many of these churches with which Wommack is aligned, there's so much rhetoric out there right now about warfare. And rhetoric that if you were to call somebody out on it would say, no, we're just talking about spiritual warfare with these demonic entities. But I've listened to churches where a pastor I heard recently was asked by a member of his congregation, do you believe in natural warfare as a way to advance the kingdom? And he goes, oh, no, I don't. But I'll tell you this, if we get really good at taking territory back from Satan, we might cause a war not meaning to. And so you hear that kind of rhetoric, which is very dangerous for upholding our democratic republic.
Absolutely, and I will say, while I can speculate that it was sort of a fabulous remark, in the context, both of all of the spiritual warfare talk that is dominant in some of that strain of belief, his own comments that another civil war would be worth it, and our inability to actually know what he meant about that armory comment, it is at the very least something that should probably be investigated by a law enforcement body. I've heard a similar rumor. I can't personally speak to it, right? Like, it's the sort of thing that they would likely deny forever unless somebody were to actually investigate it. And I think that that's something that it's not out of the ordinary for people to petition people like Chief Deisler or even the state AG about. This is not saying like sick an investigation on them. This will be interpreted by them as saying sick an investigation on them to be malicious. In reality, as this man has made a series of troubling comments culminating with the claim that he is stockpiling more weapons than your local police department, that's the sort of thing that's worth looking into and worth having an actual agency look into. So it's worth taking seriously, it really is.
Thank you, John, for that question. Thank you to both of you, and I think we have time for one more, and we have one anonymous question.
I was handed an anonymous question about something I had written in my series, but forgot to mention earlier about the investigation into the murder of Adriana Trujillo. Jason Meixel will not close that investigation. And until that investigation is closed, they will not release any public records about it. It has been almost 2 full years. There is absolutely no doubt as to who killed Adriana. It was Sean Mills. They know that because he then killed himself and died with the gun in his hand. There is no question whatsoever. They do not even pretend there is an open question. They have not surrendered most of her possessions back to her family, although after months of her mother absolutely rightfully haranguing him, they did finally, the same week I published my story, give Adriana's journals back to her mother. They have not handed over her cell phone. They have not handed over her computer. They have not fulfilled any records requests, and they will continue to deny all records requests until the case is closed, which only Sheriff Meixel can do, and which Sheriff Meixel has not done. I couldn't possibly say why. I think there are a lot of reasons that you could suspect, and the relationship between him and these organizations is certainly worth keeping an eye on, but it has caused a lot of extra pain for this family who has not been able to put this to rest, seemingly because of a situation which appears to be one of Andrew Wommack's political allies keeping the case open to keep it above scrutiny. So that is a troubling development. We gotta have it. We gotta end on a better note than that.
Okay, you're right, you're right.
And the investigation is still open. Night, everybody.
Oh, that's the same question.
Oh.
It's about the arsenal.
We got it.
All right, Jeralee,
Jeralee.
are you still here?
Where's Jeralee?
Did
Did I
Jeralee
lose
leave?
Jeralee? Oh no, we got Jeralee. She doesn't want to come up
You
on
don't
stage.
wanna
She's
come
not
up?
going to want to come up on
Okay,
stage.
I'm gonna
She's
read
never
it.
going to want to.
Okay.
And we respect that, Jeralee.
Sorry, I'm just reading your whole question before I say it out loud.
You know more about this than me. You're going to stump me up here. About stolen election, they won't sit by and watch it happen again. And so this talks on the arsenal as well, right? If it's not a cult, what is it? Is essentially the question. There's been all this extremist rhetoric. There's been all of this. I think it is proper, although John, as the PhD candidate, should check me on this. Nicole's going to roll her eyes because I'm once again going to bring up Max Weber's cult sect typology, which I try to wedge into like way more conversations than you would ever guess.
Hey, I like it. It's not
Weber would probably identify Charis as a sect, less than as a cult. It has diverged from normal Orthodox Christianity to a certain extent. It has also fused itself with specific political goals and political coalitions. And I think that's really the sort of not the church down the street answer. I think it's probably fair to call it a sect, although I'll have John check me on that in a second. Beyond that, you can, I think it is fair to characterize it in some way as hostile, and its approach to the town as hostile, whether or not we can technically classify it as a cult. It can be something harmful and something aggressive and something hostile without being a cult. And so in terms of what it is, it's the religious group trying to take over your town. And that's terminology I've wrestled with as well, and talking about it as a sect or a religious group, specifically because I don't fully feel comfortable calling it a cult, but also because I don't want to phrase it in some way where people are going to walk away thinking this is just a church or just a Bible college, because that feels somehow actually somewhat more wrong than portraying it as a full-blown cult. I think that it is a little bit past the halfway line there. So I would be less concerned about the terminology, although I totally get it, and I've spent so long obsessing over the terminology, than I would about the actions, what they have made perfectly clear, and the intent that they keep declaring. Whether or not they're a cult, they've been very open about their desires for this town, and you're under no obligation to submit to those desires simply because we cannot, under Dr. Stephen Hassan's BITE model, classify them as a cult. Everything else remains the same.
Yeah, and one element I would add to that, I affirm the terminology for some can be off-putting because the minute you put a cult label on it, they think you're being sensationalistic. But if we can identify where there are forms of authoritarian behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control, it is worth really taking that seriously and recognizing that one person's experience in a group may be more cultic than another person's, depending upon their temperament, depending upon their family dynamics, depending upon their investment in the ministry. The last thing I'll add, a little bit of charismatic and Pentecostal history. There was a gentleman named William Branham back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. He was a faith healer, was part of what was called the Voice of Healing movement. These healing revivals included people like Oral Roberts, people today that came out of those movements like Kenneth Hagin, who's part of the Word of Faith Prosperity movement. But guess who else was part of the divine healing movements in the mid-20th century? A little-known character named Jim Jones. And so I was listening to something about Jim Jones last night, and you know, as I go to bed listening to things about Jim Jones.
Light stuff, you know.
Yeah. But 900 to 1,000 people were slaughtered by adherence to an ideology. And so we need to recognize that the labels don't matter as much as what these dangerous groups can, well, what groups for some may be dangerous, may evolve into to become dangerous for all, to become not only dangerous for the church members, but the community, the cities, and I'm not being hyperbolic to say our nation as well.
Folks, we were going to wrap it, but we had one question left, and I cannot turn my back on a Khursheed Rogers question, so we're going to answer it. Where y'all go? Are y'all still back there? Well, y'all tell her, all right? And I think this is legitimate, right? Khursheed asks, there are currently officially Christian nations like Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and the UK. Is this Christian nationalism, or is this different than the movement we're concerned about? It is different in a couple ways. One is that the Christian nationalism we're talking about is very, very American. It's not that it doesn't exist elsewhere, but it is very distinctly and specifically American, both with the specific political views which are wed to it, which like conservatives in other countries often don't care about, right? There are plenty of places where conservatives are having completely different fights with their local liberals. So it's very, very American inflected, and it really exists in the context both of American politics and of American Christianity. In a lot of the world, Christianity is still a religion of the impoverished. It is still, the religion of widows and orphans, the poor and downtrodden. Our version of Christian nationalism has really been allowed to evolve in a place where they still see themselves as poor and downtrodden in many cases, but are in fact amongst the richest, most powerful people in the world, which creates a little bit of a different lens on things. more to the point, these sort of state churches, there are also right-wing hardcore Christians in these countries who think that their state churches are liberal, bastardized apparatchiks of the state. And if we had a state church here, that is also quite likely how our Christian nationalists would feel about it. Like the Church of England, right? They would consider it some lukewarm sort of something or other, as opposed to truly taking over. And I think that the biggest difference is that the Christian nationalist movement in the United States is not fighting for the establishment of a state church. It is fighting for the establishment of a church that is the state, and a state that is the church. It wants the laws to be based on the Bible, the punishments to be based on the Bible, instead of just saying, oh, we have a nice little group of Anglicans, and if y'all would like to hang out with them, their lead guy technically works for the king, so that's nice, right? It's not that. It's not that they want. It is a much, much firmer merging. These countries are not theocracies in any way at all. Whereas what the Christian nationalist movement, particularly in Dominionist strain, is pushing for here is much, much more theocratic. John, is there anything you would add to that to close us out here for this evening?
No. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Nicole, the other Tuff organizers. It is awesome that y'all do this.
We're getting a wave.
I think that's all right.
I got you. I'll come there. I got it.
I spent a whole number of years in campus ministry, and at Kansas State University, we had a 6 weeks long program on cults and cult-like groups. One of the presenters to that was a pastor from Colorado who lost 2 daughters, a grandchild, and a son-in-law at Jonestown. He was actually a United Methodist pastor whose daughters got involved with Jim Jones in California because he was doing the kind of things they had grown up being taught was legit and good for people. Charis might have started that way, though I don't think so. But what happens is, and you alluded to it, Logan, when they become isolated enough, they can become Jonestown.
Okay, it is an important note to close on. The building of all of that student housing is not only going to separate this organization more from this town, it is going to put people currently inside of it at greater risk. And if there is anything y'all can do both to stave off the takeover of your town, which is going to come at the hands of all the people being shoved into those residences, while also staving off a much more dangerous situation for the people who might find themselves living in them, I think doing what you can to slow the roll of that massive expansion is the name of the game. Thank y'all.
Thank you. That's it. Yeah, thank you all so much for your insightful questions, and you two for your thoughtful responses. And so important to keep this dialogue going. So thank you again, and thanks for coming out.
You know, I also forgot to announce this real quick. Nicole alluded to it earlier. We are working on a documentary about this. Stay tuned. In coming months, we'll probably announce more information, but we're working on documenting not just the Charis stuff, but everything that y'all have gone through with the school board, the mayoral elections, all of that over the last few years. We think the story of Woodland Park is truly of national importance, and we want to share it with as many people as we can.
Yeah. And so if you want to get in touch, if you want to talk, we got cards right over here. Come say hi. Thank you again.